Hey everyone, my name is Jasmine Henderson, and welcome back for season 2 of Ohio Voices Informing Energy Choices, right? So, again, my name is Jasmine Henderson, and I'll be your moderator today. A little bit about me: I am just a social justice organizer, political justice warrior, environmental justice advocate, and an emerging micro farmer. And so, today, what we're going to be talking about is how the state house budget works. But before I get into that, I would like to thank our sponsors and the people who made it possible for us to come and be in community this evening, and that is Black Environmental Leaders Association and Common Strategies. So thank you so much for that. I know this is the first episode for our new season that we have, which will be learning about what issues and policy looks like through a legislative or executive and legislative branch lens. But before we get into that, I just want to give us a refresher about what it is, or who Bell is, what we represent, and why we come on here every other week to really talk about environmental justice, what policy and what issues look like, and how we can come together as a community to figure out what that means, right? So, what is the Black Environmental Leaders? So, the Black Environmental Leaders is an organization that was founded in the Cleveland area to basically represent environmental justice and racial justice, and how the impacts of that through policy, through legislation, and through us oftentimes being left behind has had a significant impact on our lives today, on our communities today. I know last season we talked very much so about the Energy Jobs and Justice Act, but this season we'll be focusing pretty much on what legislation is and policies, and how we can make a difference through understanding the processes that this takes place. So what is our strategy for doing that? Well, here at Bell, we have an AI squared model, which is to advocate, to incubate, and to inform. So what does that mean when we talk about advocate? It's just making sure that we have a collective or a strong voice for speaking out against environmental justice and the effect that it has on BIPOC communities, right? Our next is to be able to incubate, which is create a safe space, like today, for multi-generational environmental leaders to grow, to understand one another, and to make sure that their voices are heard, and to cultivate important to us, because it is hard work making this world a better place, y'all. And our next is to inform. Inform is a clearinghouse for credible and contextualized data, right? And so what we mean by that is making sure that we are aware of the policies, we're aware of the strategies, and we're aware of other things that impact how we show up, that impacts our communities, but to make sure that we have a seat at the table while these policies and other things are being done, right? And so with that, we also began the process of making sure in 2021 that we bring together communities, local governments, foundation, and multiple sectors and public health agencies to do research, to do practice and strategy, to analyze the pressing energy, health, and climate issues that come together, to impact us today, because we understand that environmental justice is a multifaceted issue. In Ohio and across the country, there has been decades of deliberate racist and also racist policies and planning decisions that have caused tremendous environmental harm to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. For example, today it is 67 degrees in Southwest Ohio. It's beautiful, but it is quite alarming, right? And so we need to talk about the disproportionate impacts and the exposure of air pollution and water pollution and climate change and lead exposure and different things that really have impacted our community through health risks such as asthma, such as lead exposure, and such as poisoning and other life-threatening comorbidities that our communities tend to very much so be at a high impact rate for, right? And so, what do we do and how do we intend to be a solution? Because it is one thing to talk about the problems, right? But it is another thing to be a solution. And so the inform portion and the incubate portion of our strategy today is what Ohio Voices Informing Energy Choices is all about. We are a digital space in a community for our environmental justice advocates, uh, activists, and organizers to come together. I almost lost my place, y'all, because I'm talking and reading at the same time, so I don't get nervous. To understand legislation and policies and the impacts that we have, to make sure that we are aware, to make sure that we are educated, and be able to influence and impact our communities, our state, and the overall world, to make sure that this is a more equitable place for us to be able to live in. Last year, we talked about our legislation, which is the Environmental Jobs and Justice Act, right? And its impact that it would have on being such a pivotal legislation in Ohio to be able to influence workforce development in our communities through combating the systematic issues moving through Ohio that often impact us, right? So that not only is making sure our communities are safe, making sure we have a pathway to hold people accountable when harm has been done, but to make sure that we have a seat at the table to guide the state of Ohio into the 21st century when we are talking about energy needs, right? This year, we're actually going to focus on the actual places and spaces where bills like EJA must go to be codified into law. And that is our executive and our legislative branches of the government, because this season we're focusing solely on issues and policy where the meat is being made, and also how the money is being distributed, because that is what today is all about. So today we're going to focus on our Ohio State budget and get a better understanding of why is it important to look at advocacy through an economic and a budgetary perspective, to understand that if we don't understand how money and if we don't understand how policy moves, then we really are not at the seat at the table, making sure that we are having the best informed choices that we could possibly have, right? But before we get into that today, I would love to introduce one of our guests, which is Mr. Terrence O'Donnell of Dickinson Wright. Terrence O'Donnell leads the Dickinson Wright statewide firm for government relation teams and brings together over 20 years of experience to his public policy practice. His focus is advocacy at the Ohio State House with administrative law and regulatory compliance. He represents dozens of companies, trade groups, and nonprofits before the state's General Assembly and executive agency. He also collaborates with lawyers and law firms in DC to lobby together before the United States Congress. He leads and works in large stakeholder coalitions, which brings a substantial focus on a diverse array of complex public policy challenges. He represents all manners of business interests, including the renewable energy industry, and a major national brewer with an Ohio manufacturing facility, an international social media platform, and the state's largest self-insured workers' compensation provider. And also the Association for Career Technical Education. He was born and raised on Cleveland's west side. He represents a number of Northeast Ohio clients, including the Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority and the Ohio Aerospace Institute, St. Edward's High School, and a public-private partnership developing an offshore wind project in Lake Erie. I love to hear that. Terrence practices election law as well, serving as an outside counsel to the Ohio Secretary of State in appellate litigation. He also represents the Ohio Chamber of Commerce. Ooh, my Latin is bad, as an amicus curiae, so sorry about that, Terrence, before the Ohio State Supreme Court. Terrence collaborates closely with his colleagues to assist energy companies on permitting and other regulatory matters at the Ohio Power Steering Board and the Ohio Public Utilities Commission, as well as on a state level. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to turn our programming over to Terrence, because Terrence is going to give us a rundown on what the Ohio budget is and what does that process look like. So thank you so much, Terrence, for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Really happy to be here. Done some work with SEMEA and Black environmental leaders in the past, and work in some coalitions on clean energy and climate initiatives. So this is a really great opportunity for me, and I'm most appreciative. So I've been, as you said, I sort of lobbied the State House on behalf of a number of different clients. I've been doing that since 2001, which I think makes this my 10th or 11th state budget. So we do the state budget process in Ohio every 2 years. And so this is Governor DeWine's third budget. Because of term limits, he will do one more in 2 years, and that will be his last budget. The state budget, as you point out, Jasmine, is one of the reasons it's important is it's how the state develops its priorities and advocates funding to those priorities. And the state budget this cycle will be about $70 billion. Some of that is federal money that is passed through to the state, but it's about 4,000 pages long. And focuses in a couple of main areas. If you were to look at a pie chart of the state budget, healthcare would be the largest chunk, most of that being Medicaid. The second largest chunk would be education, namely K through 12, public education, and higher ed. So if people ask what are state government's priorities, if you looked at the budget, I think you'd have to say healthcare and education are really the lion's share of the spending. And everything else state government does is sort of a smaller and smaller piece of that pie, from highways and public transit to energy and environmental enforcement, the state prison system, everything else under the sun that the state does is sort of the last category. And the process, which is what we want to talk about today, and I see the representative is just joining us, and he'll be speaking too. So I certainly would refer to Representative Denson as more of an expert than myself, but the process is relatively formulaic, meaning all of the state budget has a certain rhythm to it, a certain cadence, and it sort of kicks off in early February with the governor's State of the State address, which he gave a couple of weeks ago. Representative Denson was there, I know, and Governor DeWine kind of laid out some priorities and then delivered his budget to the General Assembly, where the House of Representatives will spend the next, call it through about April or so, having hearings, devising its own version of the state budget. So they look at the governor's version, they decide what changes they want to make to it, and those changes will no doubt be very, very substantial. They will get through that in the spring, and maybe sometime in April or very early May, they will deliver that budget, they will pass it and deliver it over to the state Senate, who will take May and call it half or so of June to put their own stamp on the budget. So we now have three versions. We have a governor version, a House version, and a Senate version. All of that process, all of those hearings, all of the advocacy will take place over those months. And I always describe that as sort of open door. If anyone on this call wants to testify on the state budget, if you want to read it, if you want to weigh in, you can watch the proceedings on the internet. You can drive down to Columbus and get in line and have your moment where you describe your priorities and your advocacy to the committee. That part of the process is transparent. Now, the part that is maybe not in the textbook so much is the last 2 weeks of June, when all three versions of the budget are being kind of synthesized into one version. And they call that a conference committee. But the conference committee decisions will really wind up being made really behind some closed doors, where the Speaker of the Ohio House, Jason Stephens, the President of the Ohio Senate, Matt Huffman, and the governor's office, and some of the key folks from the Finance Committee kind of huddle. And sometimes it's hard to tell exactly where they're meeting and when and what they're talking about. But lo and behold, right at the end of June, the conference committee report will be released, and all of these sort of 5 or 6 months of advocacy get put into one document, and the House and Senate will vote on those without amendment pretty quickly. And unless something's gone horribly wrong, by June 30th, the budget will be done. And most people around Capitol Square will go home and enjoy their 4th of July. But before they do that, they will kind of have this mad scramble and, pardon the expression, but try to see what the hell actually made it in and what didn't. Because that's sort of a moment of truth right there at the end of June and early July. My last point is, if you want to impact this process, which I just laid out, our advice would be, yes, you can do public messaging, you can testify, you can provide information and data and arguments, but our advice would be really build your relationship and get to members of the General Assembly. Representative Denson has a vote on this budget. I don't. You know, there's only 33 members of the Ohio Senate, 99 members of the Ohio House who ultimately will get to vote on this behemoth of a piece of legislation. And so if you really want to have impact, get to those members. Those members are the ones meeting with their chairpersons, talking with the legislative staff who helps put this document together. And so the clock is ticking. And if you want to engage, I would say figure out what you want and talk to folks like Representative Denson. And Jasmine, with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much, Terrence, for enlightening us about how the budgetary process works in the state of Ohio. And I really couldn't have said it better. Oh, can you hear me? Okay, great. So everything's good now. Good. So thank you so much, Terrence, for enlightening us on how the budgetary process works here in Ohio. And I couldn't have said it any better. I did my own research and I was very much so interested about what takes place in June at the conference committee and how people are elected in different processes. So with that, I would like to say welcome to Representative Denson. So what I'm going to do, Representative Denson, is I'm going to give your autobiography. If you would like to say anything, you're going to come off and then we're just going to hop right into the questions for the evening, right? Because we have about 30 minutes for questioning. So right now, we are just going to talk a little bit about who Representative Cedric Denson is. State Representative Cedric Denson from Cincinnati is a third-generation Cincinnatian who has dedicated his entire career to empowering, leading, and serving citizens of Cincinnati. He currently represents Ohio's 26th House District. Representative Denson attended the School of Creative and Performing Arts to study drama, dance, music theater, and percussion. While studying there, he met city council member, and this made him realize the impact that being a public servant could have on his community. He went on to study organizational leadership at the University of Cincinnati. Upon graduating, Representative Denson began his career with the Cincinnati-Hamilton County Community Action Agency as an educator in consumer energy. He then served as the chief of staff to a council member, Wendell Young, working to bring fresh foods to and to reduce infant mortality rates in underserved neighborhoods. After serving in the city council, sorry y'all, I got a new laptop and she is telling me how new she is right now. But after serving in City Hall, Representative Denson went on to serve as the Southwest Ohio Outreach Member for Ohio's Future Action Fund, which is a labor-backed organization that charged him with building a coalition of progressive and inclusive organizations and community members to move key issues forward in the region. He is currently the Southwest Ohio Director for the Ohio Environmental Council, where he works daily to help protect the air we breathe, the water we drink, and public spaces that we enjoy. In addition to his work at OEC, Cedric is the Political Action Chair for Greater Cincinnati National Action Network, Government Affairs Chair for the African American Chamber of Commerce. And he also lives in Cincinnati with his partner and his children. So I'm going to turn it over to you for a couple seconds, Representative Denson, to say if you wanted to say anything. If not, we will hop right into questioning. Oh, you're muted. Representative Denson, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yes, we sure can.
Thank you for having me. I apologize for being tardy. I just want to jump in and get right to anything that I can share to be helpful with today's conversation.
Absolutely. Well, let's get on with this questioning, y'all. So I am moving to the questions right now as we are here. And sorry for my tardiness as I am having a new computer and it's just really different. Okay, so we already got an overview of what the Ohio budget process looks like. And so what does, and anybody can hop in, this can be popcorn style. So why does the budget process take place every 2 years? And why does it begin with the governor's office?
That is just a statutory law
okay.
That we have to go by of why it comes up every 2 years, the way it goes on the cycle that we're in the House of Representatives. we all begin a new General Assembly every 2 years. Over in the Senate, it happens every 4 years. With that being said, there's 99 of us over in the House, there's 33 in the Senate. Obviously, there's a lot more chaos that happens in the House of Representatives than there is in the Senate, but statutorily by law, we have to do this every 2 years. And I do think it's a good thing. It keeps us accountable to the things that we can measure throughout the state for what we want to do. It keeps folks engaged. In some cases, folks would say, well, it's a lot of things to do because we're at the state level, and sometimes some of those funds have to be dropped down through local municipalities. And by the time we actually get the work done, it's like we're beginning the whole process again. And that makes sense. And I think we all hear those kind of things. In the other sense, it's one of those things where you have to also remember between all of that. I remember in my first term being elected, I think within about 6 months, maybe 6 of my colleagues had already moved on to other things, and we had to replace members of the General Assembly. And so sometimes what school of thought may have existed when we began a General Assembly doesn't necessarily reflect what may be there by the time 2 years is over. And so it's a healthy conversation to have because you've got new people that are there that have been replaced, and you got different views, you got different things. And even as we've seen with just the controversy that has happened at the State House, sometimes your Speaker of the House can change. There's just a lot of things that can change. And so for most folks, they can say, oh, 4 years is perfect timing for us to get through everything. But 2 years, I think, is a healthy benchmark for us to go through a process and then say, okay, let's evaluate where we are and allow for another process to take place to make sure that we're doing what we need to do.
Thank you for that, Representative Denson. I loved how you said it was an accountability process because I couldn't find my shirt today, but I had a shirt that says policy and budgets are my love language, because I really do believe that where we allocate our money to and what policies that we decide to fund is really indicative of who we think is important in the state. So with that being said, our next question is, from what I understand, we are in a capital budget year for 2023 in the state of Ohio. And according to the Center for Community Solutions, which is based in Northwest Ohio, the capital budget is where resources are appropriated towards state land and infrastructure and funding for community projects across the state. What is the difference between an operating budget and a capital budget in the state of Ohio? And again, this is popcorn style, so anyone can answer.
Okay, I don't want to hog too much time of it, but I will. And you may see somebody pop in. I got my son here with me, and he's just came up next to me, so you may see him pop up at any moment. But on the operating side of everything, this is a standard operating procedure is the way that I see it. These are things that we just have to do to take care of the city's business, to do what we need to do. What you will also see is through that process, there is the legislative ability for members of the General Assembly, whether it be from the House or the Senate, as long as everything is agreed upon, there will be a line item budget to say, we want to spend X amount of dollars on this. And those things do happen. They happen all the time. That's why we're going through this whole process. So on the operating side, this is just what I call a standard operating procedure. It's always going to be there. When you get down to the capital budget is what I like to think of as shovel-ready projects. It becomes very interesting. We have 88 counties in the state of Ohio. Everybody deals with their process a little bit different. When Governor Kasich was in office, he had a process that was not formal, but it was more of a strong directive that said, if your county has a Chamber of Commerce, get with that Chamber of Commerce and let those folks form some type of committee. So if you have a shovel-ready project, for example, if you are a nonprofit X, Y, and Z that maybe be a theater, okay, you do community theater, and you have a theater and you have been doing all the things that you've been doing for 5-10 years, and you may have a need for a new roof. You may have a need for updating windows or something like that. And you look at a process and you say, you know, it's going to cost us $500,000 to do this, but as a community theater that is providing something to the community that is something everybody enjoys. $500,000 is a lot to us, but you know what? We got 250,000. And so what you may do is you may reach out through whatever that county's process is and say, hey, we've got some skin in the game. We want to get this done, but we need just a little bit more. One of the things about the capital budget that I've learned being a state representative is we like to fund projects where skin is in the game, and we like to be the last in. And we like being the last in, I'll just say, just as a caveat to that whole process, because then that gives us the opportunity to say we made the project happen, quite honestly. And that's just what I've seen. And so you may say, we've got $250 that we've raised on our own. We've reached out to our local city, and they may say that they have 100,000. And so we just need this last bit to get us over the hump. And so what you would end up doing, just for the sake of conversation, in Hamilton County, there is a board that is formed here in Hamilton County where the local chamber will put together a host of leaders in the business community, and you will go in and you will present your project to say, here's who we are, here's what we need, here's what we got, and here's what we want. And what that group does is they come up with a whole package that they then give back to us as legislators and say, we heard all the projects from Hamilton County that want capital dollars for their project, and here's what we think you should fund. Fine. There are a lot of people that have a lot of opinions about that. My opinion is I was elected to do a job, and so I really don't need people to tell me what to do. But there is also a due diligence process where I appreciate folks wanting to sit there and have an opinion about something. So we do look at that. But when we get that recommendation, we as a Hamilton County delegation, meaning whether we are Democrat or Republican, we all come together and we look at all the projects, and we try to have a diligent conversation to make sure that we're evaluating what this group has advised us is a good idea of how we should spend our money. But at the end of the day, we have to come up with a process and a funding mechanism to make sure that we're funding the projects that we see need to be funded within Hamilton County. Once we all agree on that, the process is we turn it over to the Speaker of the House, which then becomes a part of a omnibus budget motion that has all 88 counties that have also went through whatever their process is. But ultimately, what you're going to see is all 88 counties are going to have a group of folks that come together and say, this is what we think should be funded out of the money that has been allocated to our county. And so those are one of those things where it's not really marketed. You know, it's one of those things where this is where lobbyists come into play. It's one of those things where if you know comes into play. It's one of the things that I really don't like the process of it, but the more and more that we can leverage ourselves as a county in Hamilton County to say this is what we want to do. But ultimately, I think from a statewide perspective, we should not just have a one-off on letting people just decide how we should do it. I think it should be a formal process. It should be something that is marketed to all communities for folks to know that this money is available to them in their county and how they can apply for it. We haven't come up with that. We can say it's been working thus far, but it hasn't been working. It's just worked for a very few amount of people, but I think we can do better at that.
Jasmine, I would chime in on that too. This is Terrence. You mentioned that we do an operating budget and a capital budget, which Representative Denson just described, and we do those in different years. So this year we're in the operating budget where the state will have to fund its, sort of basic services, I guess you'd call it. And then next year we'll do the capital budget, which the representative just described. And that's where they do things like bricks and mortar projects. The theater example is a really good one. Hospitals sometimes get funding but again, bricks and mortar, it's capital improvements. And one of the ways that I always remember which year we're in, capital or operating, is the capital budget is always the election year. And, I don't know that that was done on purpose or not. I can't prove it, but a lot of these local projects that get funding tend to be the popular things. And in the operating budget, when they have to do difficult things like sometimes make cuts or raise taxes, that's not done in the election year. So when you hear about a local project getting funded, like a theater in your neighborhood, you know that you're in an election year. So that's always how I keep track.
Thank you so much for that correction too, because I'm also learning myself, but the budgetary process, and it is very hard. It is very hard to understand and know everything that's going on. So thank you so much for that correction. And thank you, because we actually answered the next question, which is what funds what between the operating and the capital budget. But I think it's really important to know election year, that is a capital budget. Operating budget is on non-election years. I think there might be something to it personally as an outsider looking in. That's the privilege that I have. But I love the ability with the capital budget to be able to say funding local projects within your community, right? I think that's really important because a lot of people don't know that we have the ability to reach out and be able to influence the places and spaces within our community that could use a little bit more development through the budget process, right? So we are going to hop into our fifth question. And this is a question that's also influenced by some research that I've done with the Center for Community Solutions. Is that according to the Center for Community Solutions, there is a time for the House and the Senate members to advocate for specific needs of their community, such as the redevelopment of Cleveland's public spaces, which was funded by the Capital Project, one of the capital budgets. So how does a member of Congress know about this advocacy process? I know Representative Denson, we talked about, you said you felt like the process could be a little bit more formalized and a little bit straightforward to get funding within their community. And I also know you said that the government likes to come in at the last moment to be able to fund the rest of it, right? So how do we make this process for the capital budget more aware for next year? And then what does that process of advocacy look like for people who would like to begin this process for next year?
That's a loaded question with a loaded answer. I think it takes a lot. As far as an organization, you have to, one, understand how you could qualify for a project. You have to understand where possible partnerships could come, because right now we've been in a unique position where our ARPA dollars have dropped down through the state to local municipalities that could also aid and abet some of the things that we want to see happen on a capital side of things, and operating for that measure. Because when you get down to the local government, there are a lot more opportunities that the local government has to do with some dollars that we've gotten through the ARPA dollars. And so the question becomes, as an organization, what do I do to best position myself to get something out of the deal, right? And what you want to do is, one, educate yourself. I always tell you about knowledge is power, and there's nothing that all of us can do for you as an organization. You have to do your homework. You have to understand where your dollars are most impacted, and you have to let us know where we can be most helpful as a representative. And so when you start talking about things where do I really get something out of this? You may be looking at something and saying, we saw some federal dollars came down through the state to local. And so it becomes a homework assignment for you to even get with your local municipality of tracking those dollars. So when we approve that at the state level and it dropped down to the local level, you may want to go to your county commissioners, you may want to go to your city council and see where those dollars hit local government and say, what can we get out of this deal? And that goes back to my point, even on the capital side. It then puts you in a better position to come back for us at the state level and say, we've got some skin in the game now. Not only do we have our own investment that we've raised some money here, but then we went and the city is committed to this, or the county is committed to this. And so we just need this from you. That whole conversation makes all of this all the more better, because then it puts you in a better position where it's made just a budgetary conversation a little more closer to your goal. But for us, it's a whole collaborative approach. And when you're dealing with anything, a lot of people just like to come to one government entity, one representative, one council member, or one county commissioner, or whoever, and we need this much. We need $10 million to do this. Okay. And I need $5 million to live the rest of my life. So the point becomes, but what have you done as that organization, as that entity to say, here's my pitch deck to you. Here's what I want to do. Here's what we have in the game. Here's what my board is committed to. Here's what local government has been able to leverage from the dollars that you approve. And here's what we need. That becomes an attractive conversation. But just saying, we just deserve it, that doesn't work. And that's one of the things that, for whether I agree with that process as we are right now works or not, that's just where we are right now until we get better for how we work in our own silos of community organizations that have leveraging power of how we can do things. The reality is that's where we want. So if you want something out of the deal, those are the parameters that you need to work in and realize and understand. And if you're not going to do that, then you're not going to get anything out of the deal. And so that's just a plain reality. So when I look at all of that and I hear what you're saying about the question, I think it's incumbent of all of us. It's an incumbent on us as elected officials to understand where the rubber is meeting the road for the needs of our districts, and making sure that we are leveraging everything that we can, that we know that is available out there. And it's also incumbent on whoever is on the ground with a need to do their homework. I was never sent to Columbus to do everything for everybody. I was sent to Columbus to do something to work with everybody. And I think that's some of the parts of our communities that we have got to understand. I'm not doing everything for you. And if that's what you thought I was going to do, don't vote for me anymore. It's a collaborative agreement.
Jasmine, I think that was really well put by the representative. I'll tell you, as an advocate on the outside, again, someone without a vote, someone who doesn't set the priorities, but rather tries to influence the process. One thing I would add to that from my perspective is, like the representative said, instead of kind of demanding your priority be met or fulfilled or funded, I think that there can sometimes be a lot of value in trying to really thoughtfully assess what our state leaders and legislators are trying to accomplish and what are their priorities and what's, you know, as a state, and then where do you fit in, and almost kind of work backwards. And here's what I mean by that. If you listen to Governor DeWine's State of the State address, if you talk to the Democratic caucus in the House or the Senate or the Republican caucuses in the General Assembly, some themes will emerge about what they're trying to accomplish. And I would give a couple of examples. Governor DeWine talks about prenatal care. Ohio doesn't historically do very well with funding for prenatal care, and that's become more of a priority, I think, in my career as I've watched the budget process. Number two, clean water. The governor and the legislature has kind of come together around a new program called H2 Ohio, which puts hundreds of millions of dollars a year into water infrastructure, algae blooms on Lake Erie, lead pipe abatement. And that was something that I hadn't really seen a lot of as I witnessed the process over the couple decades. And the last one is workforce development. People are kind of obsessed in Columbus right now with figuring out how folks can get to work and how employers can find those folks that want to get to work. And so just in this transportation budget going on right now, there was an appropriation put in on a bipartisan basis to add $30 million to a grant program for ODOT, the Department of Transportation, to figure out last mile, first mile challenges with folks who use public transit but are trying to get to work. And I don't think any individual transit authority, to use that example, like had that at the absolute top of their list. But once they figured out that workforce was a priority for the state, again, I say working backwards, they're kind of figuring out like, well, okay, how do we fit into that? Wait a minute, we have a massive role to play in helping people get to work. And so the representative used that word partnership. I think state local partnerships and trying to figure out where your individual desires fit into the big picture is time well spent. And, you know, Representative, I don't know if I said that the best way, but I'd love to hear your take just on how you probably see some good advocates. You probably see some not so good advocates sometimes come in asking for things.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I think, and it's a learning curve for everybody. I mean, I always say, even for representatives, most folks don't figure it out in 2 years. In the first year, you finally figure out where your office is at and get back there the same way without getting lost. And so it's a whole learning curve for everybody. And once you really figure out what being an advocate for your district is, what being a representative as a larger body for the state of Ohio is, it's very complex. But what you want is to be able to work with partners that actually understand what advocacy is. It's just like anything. If you go to do something, I can only make this work if you give me something to work with, right? And so when you think about a district of over 100,000 people and everybody wants something, I need you to stand out. And you just come to me and saying, we deserve this. That's not good enough. No matter what process we have in place. And that's just the reality of anything. And so some of our communities have got to be very diligent in the understanding of that. I think that comes with a whole complex package of what that means to even get to having that ask. That comes from your advocacy of having an advocacy day at the State House, where you're taking your members of whatever your concern is up to the State House and meeting with your district delegates and saying, here's what we are thinking about, here's what we're paying attention to, here are some bills that impact what we care about, and here's what we think about them. That also then comes with staying in contact as you see things. Make sure you have that open communication. After you've maybe done an advocacy day, or you've made an initial attempt to maybe have an in-district day where in your area you have invited everybody down from that delegation to say, here's what we care about, whether it's at the State House or whether it's at home. We're gonna come. But then the next step I think that's very important is keeping an eye on all the bills that affect any of your space that you're working in and saying, here's what we think about it. Here's what our members are saying. Here's what people who we collaborate with, work with are saying. That gives us a lot of intel, because one thing about being one of 99 and over almost 800 bills that will show up in a General Assembly, I would be crazy to tell you I'm an expert on everything that comes through. But if I have that partnership and I have that relationship with an organization, individuals who care about certain things that I know what they're talking about, and you relaying that information to me, it makes my day easier. It makes your life easier, because it could be something that could just kill your entire industry of what you're working on and what you're trying to do. It could be something that I could then, once you have fed that to me, because we now have this relationship that is established, I can go work on the other side of the aisle if it's on the majority side of something that's going to be detrimental or impactful to your side. And we can have a conversation. That's the whole purpose of why we're there. And that's not something that should be omitted. Oh, well, they're just in a minority and they can't get anything done. That's not true. The reality is we get a lot done. And if you look at some of the bills that we pass, even though it may be a Republican passing it, it may be something that we might even not support as Democrats on the floor. We did something that might have made that bill a little bit better that could have saved the whole industry. And the last part is about that is, whenever you wanted to advocate for anything, you have just got to be present. It is so hard, and I understand. Coming to Columbus, it's a pain. It is a pain. But if you have done your homework on all those other things, even you sending one person there, if you have showed up in mighty numbers, you've stayed in contact on making sure we understand what's happening. When it comes time for the rubber to meet the road, when you have to make an ask, even if it's one or two people coming from your space of work, it's just as impactful as everybody that has showed up along the way. You've already laid the groundwork, you've done what you needed to do, and now your representative, your senator, now you've given us a job to do. And that's where accountability comes into play, in my opinion, for what we're actually able to do as representatives, no matter what side of the aisle you're from. And so I hope all that makes sense, just in terms of how you can maybe take an approach. It doesn't mean it's the right way, A lot of people have different ways that they want to do things, but for me, I'm just a simple guy. Let's have a conversation. If I see an opening and it's something I'm really there with, I'll say, yeah, here, let's work on that. But sometimes you get in conversations where I'll say, you know what, education, it's a very complex issue. But you know what, right down here in Hamilton County, Representative Jessica Miranda, she served on the local school board and she really gets this. Let me take you over to her because this might be something that she can advocate better for you on. You're going to get some of those conversations too, but the whole point is you've got to lay a foundation for everything. You can't just say, come here and this is what you owe me. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that in the real world, doesn't work like that in the politics world. This is all of our tax dollars at play, and we all have got to make a case for why it makes sense for us to do anything we should do for all of our stakeholders.
Thank you for that, Representative Benson, and thank you also, Terrence. I think the things that I got, and we're getting ready to wrap up because we're closing in on the 7 o'clock hour, is A from Terrence, and I'm putting this in the order that I think it should go in. Please let me know if I'm wrong. Is understanding the themes and the priorities that our elected officials already have on their agenda. B is collaboration. Well, B would then be education. Once you understand the themes and you understand what the priorities are, seeing where your personal priorities, needs, and values align with that, and properly educating yourself, not only around the process, but around what it is that you actually need to be able to have a concise ask. The third is the ability to be able to reach out, develop a relationship, and develop a collaborative relationship that allows you to be able to influence and to be able to have an open and honest conversation with your elected officials, right? And I would think, lastly, the thing that would be there is accountability. Now, I really want to focus in these last couple of seconds on what accountability looks like. So here at Bell, we are always looking for ways to see how we can influence and how we can change policy to make it more equitable and make it more just for BIPOC communities. During the budgetary process, are we allowed to testify?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yes. And so,
Absolutely.
go ahead.
I think testifying, if I'm going to be completely honest, I think testifying it's a part of the process, but it's more towards the end of the process. It's all the things that we've talked about. You almost want to start at the end and work your way backwards, right? You want to make sure that one, what I'm advocating for, is this something ultimately that the governor is going to support? Is this something that both chambers are going to support, both the House of Representatives and the Senate? Is this a conversation that is going to be an infant that is going to hopefully get legs and start to walk? And so testifying is a part of that process, but I kind of see it as if you're making a sandwich, that may be part of the middle point that you get to, but you still got some work to do, right? So we talked about that foundational work that you lead up to. And so maybe everything that we've talked about, from, reaching out and having all those things happen, then a process starts to happen where now you're live and you're on prime time. And this gives you an opportunity, as you've done some of that homework of working with your representative, knowing that they're working with other folks on that committee that your issue may be in, that they've had some conversation and influence on, as well as you, because that's part of the homework assignment as well. And so when you go and you have testimony, you as that organization or entity, individual, or whatever you're advocating for, it's almost one of those things where you're not going to say anything out loud that's going to leave you stumped up. You want to make sure that you understand everybody on that committee. You want to know where they're coming from, and you want to have done your due diligence to meet with them prior to them saying anything that makes your bill that you're advocating for, or funding, or whatever the case may be, look bad. I mean, that's just one of the things one-on-one that you have to do throughout this process. And even if you know what that stump is going to be, you know how to get over it. And so the reality there becomes, once you get on prime time and you have to give a testimony on something, you know where your dark spots are going to come from those members, and be ready to answer those and be ready to hold still with that. So that is one of the biggest components of this, because that's when everything goes live. And then that's when sometimes you figure out you may have more advocates out there, and then sometimes you may figure out you have more opponents out there. But that point, you have done enough homework where you've got some grip on the issue that at least allow you to know where some of your proponents and opponents are. And so if you end up giving that testimony and some things come out publicly, it may blindside you and you go, oh, I know who I need to talk to about this because we've already aligned with this, and I know the type of organizations that they're aligned with. You start to become more smarter in the process. But there's still the last part of it. You got to make sure that what you're advocating for gets out of that committee, gets to that floor, gets to the other chamber, whether it's the Senate or the House of Representatives, and it passes. But ultimately, you have to make sure that Governor DeWine puts pen to paper, and it's going to happen, because you can do all of that, and it's for what? In 2 years is a very, very, very fast time. Like I said, we end up with over 800 bills that will happen in the General Assembly. And so the idea of you getting something done, it becomes very cumbersome and it becomes very time consuming for this to happen. A lot of times that's why you see bills where it may be a bill about how we dispose of tires, but an amendment may be added to that bill about how we're dealing with the park issue. I mean, you would never understand why things happen the way it does, but that advocacy that you can do to really include your representatives to advocate for you and do what they should be doing, and what I should be doing, means that at the end of the day, no matter what, I'm getting done what you need to see happen. I hope that makes sense.
It makes a good amount of sense. Thank you so much. I really wish we could really talk more about the amendment process and the earmark process, but we're really closing in on our hour, and I want to value our times because that was one of the questions that we had, but we don't actually have a lot of time to answer that question around the earmark and the amendment processes. For that. So I hope that we'll be able to talk about that in some of our upcoming episodes that we have. But I just wanted to round out and really touch base again on what I heard both Representative Denson and Terrence say. So again, number one, thank you, Terrence, for giving us an overview of what the budget looks like, because it's very complicated. And I have been trying for a year to learn the budget myself through self-education, and it still hasn't gotten any easier. As y'all saw on here, I still did not know that we were in a operating budget year versus a capital. So it's little things like that just takes time overall. But education, a knowledge about your issues, knowledge about who to collaborate with, and knowledge about the themes are some of the things that I've heard Representative Denson and also Terrence talk about. Also knowing who are the appropriate people to reach out to. Yes, always reach out to your representative and your senator that represents your district, but they might not be the subject experts on that. So please pay attention to the committees. Another thing we have to understand here is the Finance Committee manages the budget for both the House and the Senate. Now, the process is a little bit different for the Senate because sometimes the other committees will act as subcommittees for the Finance Committee. We're not really sure how that process will happen right now in the Senate from the research that I understand. But in the House, we have subcommittees. The subcommittees are where you would give testimony if you were going to give testimony, but please understand what Representative talked about and what he said, that is sort of the middle of the sandwich. So what I understand is he is not recommending that you go blindly into giving testimony without understanding the people who are on the subcommittee, what they think is important, their motivations, their intent, but holistically understanding the resources you're asked, what you need, and how you will be viewed through the lens of a person who has the power to be able to uphold, uplift, or transition that. Another thing we did not get a lot of time to be able to talk about was the governor's perspective. So the last part, right on January 30th, a lot of times the budget will be rolling into the governor's office before July 1st, which is the beginning of the new fiscal year, right? And with that being said, he has the ability to be able to veto appropriations, right? And so the veto of appropriations is really who has the budgetary authority to be able to spend the money, but the governor cannot make changes to the budget or veto the budget itself, but can make differences on appropriations, right? So I wanted to highlight that and say that in the meantime also, because I think that's very important, because we need to understand what the governor thinks is important. So Terrence talked about how the governor has really, he's seen an increase in clean water initiatives and also prenatal services that are being offered and different things like that. So I wanted to really highlight that for us as a collective to be able to understand how we can do the informing and influence of what we believe to be the best that works for us, our community, and our resources. And with that, I will see if Terrence or Representative Denson has any final words. And if not, we'll be closing out for the evening.
Nothing from me.
Absolutely. So did I do a good job closing that up, y'all? Did I do a good job closing that up? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Representative Denson and Mr. Terrence O'Donnell for being here. And representing us and telling our community what it means and how we should show up for the budgetary process. And this is, again, Ohio Voices Informing Energy Choices. I'm your moderator. My name is Jasmine Henderson, a West Daytonian through and through. And this conversation was about the budgetary process. So thank you so much for coming out and learning with us this evening. And we will see you next week. Bye, y'all.